Hey, what's up? Hello, everybody. Alex Kapitko here, and this is the Centered from Reality podcast. Apologize for those who are watching. I might look a little disheveled today, my hair and everything. On Tuesdays, I have some classes in the city, and I like to run there and back. I call them backpack runs. It's a good way to kill two birds with one stone, get to class, get my exercise for the day. And I've been kind of running around today, so yeah. And didn't feel like putting on a hat, so you get to look at my wild hair. But hey, I put on a collared shirt, so not totally bad. But first, I just wanted to start with a few things kind of outside of today's topics. We're going to touch on Ukraine, the Civil War, and the Republican Party, kind of my thoughts on the Olympics so far. But first, I just wanted to thank everyone, actually, for the good feedback I got on the Joe Rogan episode I did. Honestly, I was kind of hesitant, as I said in that episode, to put out my thoughts on Joe Rogan, just because it's kind of a divisive topic right now. And, I think a lot of people did actually like kind of the objective perspective I tried to use in it, just because I think he's a good guy. But I also think that he's kind of isolated himself into a more conspiratorial, more socially conservative bubble, and it's definitely impacted him. So, unfortunately, since that episode, there's been another controversy with him involving that video compilation of him using a word that should never be used, and I'm talking about the derogatory term, the N-word. I watched Joe's video apology for using this word, and I genuinely think that it was an awful taste. No one should ever use that word. I know he defended it, saying he used it in quotes to quote other people. I don't really care. It was despicable and gross. And I don't really know what's next, because he was wrong and ignorant, but I don't really know what else to say, to be honest. And I wasn't even sure I wanted to talk about this to start, because, okay, he apologized. He knows he was wrong. They took off the episodes. What else can he do? I don't think it's ever going to be enough. People want him off Spotify. Rumble wants him, that Canadian kind of Trumpian social media app, or not streaming app, I guess you could say. I just don't really know what people want from him. At this point, I don't think he's racist. I think that he's ignorant and isolated, and it's pointless for me to keep defending him. But I don't think he's racist. I think he has good intentions most of the time. So yeah, I just wanted to start with that. But also, before we started, I wanted to give a movie recommendation, because it's actually got to kind of go into the context of a few things I wanted to talk about today, and that was not done on purpose. It just kind of worked out that way. But last night I watched a movie called Munich, The Edge of War, and it's on Netflix. It came out, I think, in late 2021, and the basic summary of the movie is that in the fall of 1938, so kind of right before World War II kicks off, Hitler's preparing to invade Czechoslovakia, and the government of Neville Chamberlain is looking for some sort of a peaceful solution. And a British civil servant and a German diplomat who were classmates traveled to Munich to discuss peace. I watched this movie last night, really well done. It was a good suspense drama, and you are completely along for the ride. Sometimes I have issue watching long, slow, kind of political thrillers, but this one was great. It's just interesting to see how everyone kind of thought they could appease Hitler, and maybe if they did this, he wouldn't do Y, and this German diplomat who studied at Oxford, it's interesting because he goes from someone who supports Nazi Germany, supports Hitler in 1932, to someone who tries to assassinate Hitler in 1938, and it's interesting to see how he turns from a supporter of this nationalist Nazi movement into someone who's terrified of what the monster it's created is. And I think there's a lot of things to be taken away in our modern era from that. It's also interesting to see Neville Chamberlain, who was truly convinced that appeasement was the right policy. And the movie makes it clear that, the English completely misunderstood what Hitler wanted. They thought they could just let him take something and maybe he would not invade anymore. But clearly he saw violence and force as being necessary to just expand. And it just made me fascinated because the movie actually tries to paint a better light on Chamberlain and how history's kind of been harsh on him. Kind of the argument of the movie is that he may have bought the Allies enough time because instead of letting Hitler invade in 1938, the Munich Agreement gave the Allied forces a year or so to prepare, which is actually quite interesting. And some argue this was enough time for the Allies to prepare and then have the forces willing to fight the Nazis and win. So I actually found another book that I want to read called Appeasement that's actually about this because I think in school we learn appeasement, bad policy. Neville Chamberlain led to giving Hitler things, giving him more and more, and he kept just taking it and running with it. And there's probably some truth there, but history, it's hard to judge history, I think, out of the context of the time it was in. And so I highly recommend it. And so basically today I want to do some updates on what is happening in Ukraine because while the U.S. and Britain seem more concerned and reactionary, other NATO allies don't seem to be as worried, or they're a little bit worried about the escalation by rhetoric or by media coverage. And it's kind of interesting to me. But so anyways, I hate to draw this parallel, but I started by talking about this Munich movie I watched, and one could argue in some ways that what is happening in Ukraine right now with Russia is another attempt at appeasement. No one wants a ground war, so we're trying to find a way to stop a ground war from happening. So we're trying to see what can we give Putin to stop this from happening while also not violating what we believe is our ethical code or our political ethical code, whatever you want to call it. Because leading up to the Second World War, talk in the U.S. and the U.K. was that no one wanted a war on the continent. So why not try to appease Hitler and slow him down? I know I'll have people push back and say Hitler is not Putin, Putin's not Hitler. That's not what I'm saying. I am just saying that in history, sometimes if you don't understand who your adversary is, it's kind of a futile effort to try to understand them and appease them. So I want to do some updates on what is happening in Ukraine. So let's look at the French side first because Emmanuel Macron has been very busy, and I think rightfully so, because obviously I think Europe should be more involved in these disputes in some ways than the United States, just because, well, they're closer, and it's their continent that they're involved in, and yeah. So on Monday, Macron and Putin met. I've mentioned this before, but with Angela Merkel stepping down, Macron has tried to kind of step up as the new, I don't want to say leader of the EU because obviously he's not, but as kind of the new centerpiece of a unified EU. Angela Merkel was kind of the de facto leader of the EU in some ways. And Emmanuel Macron wants to be the central figure in this new era, and I think he can do it. I was just reading today in The Economist that it's likely he's going to be reelected coming up, and I like Emmanuel Macron. I don't like everything about him. I don't like his vaccine mandates. But I think in an international sphere and what he wants to do for the EU, he's a good actor. So, according to a news conference which was covered by the Associated Press, the French President Emmanuel Macron on Tuesday, so today, said President Putin has assured him that he will not escalate the Ukraine crisis. This was after a 5-hour talk with Putin, and I guess Macron said that Putin won't be initiating an escalation and that the objective is met for preventing an escalation of the conflict. And I hope Macron is right, and we need to hope he is, but I just find it weird because at the same time that Macron is saying, don't worry, we've met the criteria, Putin is not going to start a ground war, Russian forces are getting close to having around 130,000 troops on different parts of the Ukrainian border, and the supplies on the border outnumber that. So that tells me that, okay, so if you already have 110, 120,000 troops, but you have enough supplies for 150 or 200,000, it means you're getting the supplies set up so then you can put more troops on later. That doesn't make me feel too good. So I feel like I feel like Macron is being optimistic, and I think we like a little healthy optimism around here. But on February 5th, I saw that according to U.S. assessments, which there's always issues with that, but apparently Vlad Putin has 83 tactical groups of roughly 750 troops each on the border, which amounts to about 70% of the forces he would need to maximize a full invasion. Last week, we saw that Biden sent another 3,000 troops to Eastern Europe, mainly Poland. And there's apparently, according to the AP today, there's another 8,000 on high alert for the coming weeks. So about 11,000 troops potentially that are going to be in Eastern Europe fairly soon. I don't like the sounds of that for what Macron says is no worries of escalation. So what this tells me is that I think we have a shrinking window of time here to see if Putin's going to invade. Now, February 20th was the date in 2014 where I guess you could say it marked the Ukrainian-Russian conflict involving Crimea and the Donbas region and other parts. And to make things more interesting, this is also the day the Olympics end. I've doubted, that Putin would want to invade during the Olympics just because he's friends with Xi. Those of you who watched the opening ceremony, he was one of the only world leaders there. So I don't think Putin wants to cause a distraction during the Olympics. But the Olympics end on February 20th, which is also the day marking the 2014 invasion of Crimea and other regions in that eastern Ukraine side. So it would be kind of surreal, and I'm just speculating. Again, there's nothing to tell us right now this is what to believe, but there's a small window. Putin's waiting. If he was going to invade, it would probably be sometime around February 20th or into early March. But remember, the ground is going to start thawing after that, and so there's a small window. It's shrinking, and so pretty much the next couple weeks might be when he does it or when he doesn't do it. Now I just need to add that I am one of the people who does not think that Putin wants a ground war. If you just do what they teach you in middle school, or I guess maybe elementary school, I don't know, but like where you just draw a pros and cons list, and if you're Vlad Putin, the cons outweigh the pros. But anyways, I guess on a very superficial, simple level, I do like that Macron is meeting with Putin and talking. I said a few weeks ago that Trump pulled out of a decent amount of arms treaties during his presidency. And mix that with the humiliation that Putin feels after the end of the Cold War. And I think Putin wants people to give him attention. He's like, it's kind of the Napoleon complex, He's like, we're small now, we need to be heard, blah, 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 blah. So I think it's good they're talking because at the end of the day, I think that's what Putin wants is international recognition. But that's a whole other story. But Macron has been busy because on Monday, he also talked with Vladimir Zelensky of Ukraine, who I find to be fascinating, comedian who played a president who all of a sudden becomes the president. And he basically said that both he and Putin are willing to implement the Minsk Protocol. I'll go into the Minsk Protocol in a few minutes, but we talked about this on the Tonic Accord, Drew and I did a while ago, but the Minsk Protocol is basically the agreement that ended, well, it didn't really end, but at least it kind of cooled down the Ukraine conflict in 2014 when they seized the Crimean Peninsula. Obviously, Russia hasn't been directly in Ukraine since then, but now there's Russian-backed separatists that still are. So anyways, I'll start. So the Minsk Protocols basically had two parts. The first part, and remember, Russia did agree to this back in 2014, or I think it was 15 by the time it was all done. But the first part of it included prisoner exchanges, deliveries of humanitarian aid, and a withdrawal of heavy weapons. And this was about 5 months into the conflict. And at that point, more than 2,600 people had been verified or confirmed as killed. And so Russia agreed to this. It was basically making sure more people don't die and taking out hard weapons and delivering humanitarian aid. And I mean, that's good they agreed to it. And then the second part of the Minsk protocols, according to the documents I'm looking at here, set out a series of military and political steps that actually are not implemented. Like I mentioned, there's like point 10 of it, and I'm just skimming through it. There's multiple points here, but point 10, for example, of part 2 of the Minsk protocols calls for the withdrawal of all foreign armed formations and military equipment within the 2 disputed regions, which is Donetsk and Luhansk. And Ukraine says this refers to forces from Russia, but Moscow denies it has any there. And that's where it gets kind of complicated here, is that the Minsk protocols basically put a lot of blame on Russia having forces in the area. But in a weird way, Russia just kind of... Obviously, they had some forces there, but it seems like mainly they kind of used disinformation, propaganda, and local separatist movements to kind of create a homegrown rebellion. And so, like, the Minsk protocols make sense if you're looking at Russia leaving the country, but they don't look as much at the fact that Russia's there indirectly. And that's why I was interested when Zelensky says that him and Putin are both willing to implement the Minsk protocol. Because to me, that happened in 2014, and still we have a decent amount of chaos and instability in eastern Ukraine and in the Crimean region. So that's fascinating to me, because also Russia just doesn't seem to think they're part of the problem. Again, you know, Putin is really good at gaslighting all of us in a way about his involvement. I don't know if it's just total narcissism, ego, or Putin's just a methodological liar. I don't really know. But before I get into now what is happening on the Biden side, which there's also stuff to talk about on the Biden side, I must add that I'm glad, you know, that Zelensky is meeting with Macron, because I think it's important. You know, the U.S. media and a lot of NATO allies, especially the U.K. and the U.S., have almost been, like, focused on this conflict and, like, expecting it to turn into a full-blown war. And I think it's important to remember the perspective of Ukraine, who's actually the ones involved in this. You know, just last week, Zelensky asked for countries like the U.S. to slow down their rhetoric and slow down their coverage of this, because they could lead to war as well. And even Putin has said that the U.S. are the ones so fixated on war. And I don't want to defend Putin. I don't want to sound like Tucker Carlson here either. But it does seem like our media coverage and just kind of the whole dynamic in the U.S. media cycle right now is just looking at the potential for war. And I think Zelensky rightfully says, like, we've been expecting issues with Putin for decades. It's nothing totally new. But the thing is, we don't want to feed the bear and also buy into Russian disinformation at the same time. And I think that's super important. Now moving on. Okay, so now France and Ukraine aside, Joe Biden actually yesterday, I want to say, met with Olaf Scholz, who's the new chancellor of Germany, social democrat. I talked about him a while ago. You know, he was kind of a big switch up in German politics, because Angela Merkel had been the big key for a long time. His party is now in control. And so Biden met with him, and they mainly talked about this and kind of the impact of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline and why it's a big factor in why Germany's maybe not been as directly hawkish with Russia. And just a reminder, this pipeline is kind of an offshore natural gas pipeline, because we have to remember, I think Russia is like 2 or 3 in terms of natural gas in the world right now. And this is a natural gas pipeline that runs from the Baltic Sea out of Russia to Germany. Conveniently, this pipeline skips Ukraine, which, if you want to put on your tinfoil hat, there's probably things you could talk about there. But anyways, a lot of people were shocked that this pipeline was streamlined under the Angela Merkel chancellorship, because just some red flags off the bat is that it really does jeopardize Europe's energy security and their energy independence, right? I mean, you're getting a very important resource, especially in the cold of the winter, from a country that is always kind of like peeping in through the cracks of the wall, going like, when can we take advantage of them? it's just weird. It really isn't useful, to rely on Russian gas. But anyways, according to an article from the AP, in quotes here, President Joe Biden met with Germany's new leader Monday and vowed that the crucial Nord Stream 2 pipeline will be blocked if Russia invades Ukraine, end quotes. And Russia / Putin have already responded by saying that this doesn't matter because the West are calling for war. Again, Putin's gaslighting us. It's true, the American media covers these type of things. They're sensational, blah, blah, blah. But I don't think anyone actually wants war. So now, this threat from Biden about the pipeline being shut down if Putin were to invade is interesting, right? But I think it gets complicated because I think it would hurt Germany as much as it would hurt Russia. I think everyone would get hurt in this situation. Like, obviously the Russian economy isn't booming like it used to. The world's changed and it's kind of a declining empire or republic. I mean, it's not an empire anymore, but anyways, so shutting down this pipeline would hurt Russia economically, obviously. However, it would also cause serious supply problems for Germany. I've also read in The Economist that this would likely lead to a large change in energy costs in Europe and beyond. So, with inflation, the pandemic, you could just name a plethora of issues. Shutting down this pipeline would not be a great idea. Now, there's something interesting, too, that I read today that I'll admit I didn't know. But apparently, construction of the pipeline, according to the AP, has been completed, but it's not operating yet. Now that, I think, is where there could be leverage on Germany's side. No one's getting fuel from this pipeline yet. Yes, it's been created, it's been implemented, it's ready to go, but it's not pumping out natural gas into Germany yet. And I think that is where Biden is probably correct to say, hey, now, it would be one thing if people all of a sudden are paying higher energy prices and they're not getting as much natural gas from Russia, but they haven't used the gas yet and aren't used to it. So I think Russia would be hurt in a more direct way than Europe, just to say. Another issue from what I've read is that Germany and the U.S. just really aren't on the same page. I covered this election in Germany a while ago, and it was huge because Germany is now quite fractured with its coalition, which I've heard people call the stoplight coalition, just due to the different parties' colors. But the left, center-left, did fairly well in the elections, and it's been a big change in foreign policy goals that have kind of been stemming from that. So, as I mentioned earlier, Angela Merkel, center-right, the Christian Democrats. Scholz is not. He's a chancellor, but he's part of the Social Democratic Party. There's also a growing green movement in Germany, as well as more hesitancy in general towards foreign intervention. I think you see that in the U.S. as well, where on the more progressive left, there's less of a willingness to chastise Venezuela, Cuba, China, etc. And I think we're seeing that happen in these more progressive movements in Germany as well. There's a hesitancy to sometimes be as critical, I guess, on authoritarian regimes, which I think is abhorrent, but that's a whole other conversation. But I believe these factors are kind of complicating, would be the best word, internal dynamics in Germany, just kind of over how to respond. Because I think in the past it would be easy to say, we will come down with an iron fist. But like this new generation of progressivism, especially in Europe, is just not for it. So during the meeting on Monday with Scholz, Biden and Scholz did talk about how there is ambiguity mainly about sanctions. And there doesn't seem to be a shared idea over what the right sanctions would be or how to properly respond to Russia if they did invade Ukraine. And now I've heard foreign policy experts in the U.S. say that we're slowly getting closer to a consensus. But Scholz said that the sanctions, like right now, we can't agree on the actual proper sanctions. And even in the United States, there isn't really an agreement or a breakdown on whether or not sanctions work. And so I don't think sanctions are a great idea, but if they're the alternative to war, we should probably go for it. But we've seen a weird shift is where in the U.S., it seems like the progressives and Biden are kind of pro escalating something here while the right is like staying out. I don't know. It's all weird. And then Germany's on their own page. So like, I think we need to let Europe kind of be in the driver's seat here, because the last thing the U.S. wants is a war far away from us that we don't particularly agree on or understand, especially after what happened with all these Middle Eastern conflicts we've had, and more specifically Afghanistan. And of course, I've left out NATO, Putin's vision of NATO, Western expansion in, not even Western expansion, but NATO's expansion into the East, blah, 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 blah. But I've left those out because I think it's also to understand what France and the US and Ukraine and the UK are all thinking, because it seems like Putin is just trying to confuse us and put us on our toes and gaslight us and almost see how we react. Now, I just wanted to leave this one part here with another concept, and it's known as Finlandization. Finlandization really rolls off the tongue. And it's something that Macron has mentioned a few different times, and it's something kind of interesting because I've heard about Finland during this time, but I haven't heard that term. But it basically describes how Finland, during the Soviet era, was kind of able to maintain its sovereignty while living next to the Soviet Union. You know, it was able to stay neutral and outside of the Soviet sphere without starting a conflict on either side. Obviously, times have changed, but it's something interesting to look into. Is because the New York Times says that the term refers to Finland's strict neutrality during the Cold War, enshrined in a 1948 treaty with Moscow, when tensions between the USSR and the West were at a high. The treaty ensured Finland that unlike other countries in Eastern Europe, it would not face a Soviet invasion, but in return, Finland agreed to stay out of NATO and allowed the giant next door to exercise significant influence over its domestic and foreign policy. I like part of that. I'm a compromise guy, if you guys haven't gathered that by now. I think that's probably the best bet here is compromise with Russia if we don't want a giant violent war. That being said, I don't want Russia putting their influence over Ukraine, over their domestic affairs like they did to Finland. But I do like the idea of maybe saying, hey, we're not going to try to grandfather Ukraine into NATO. We're not going to try to help. Diatribe here maybe, but I read a few months ago that the CIA's been over there helping Ukrainian forces train for a potential Russia invasion. I'm sure that scares the shit out of Putin. Maybe we don't send the CIA into Ukraine. And then maybe Russia promises not to put 130,000 troops on the Ukrainian border. Maybe that's a fair compromise. Call me crazy, but we're in an era where a ground war just seems ridiculous. Now, before we change subjects, I do want to show a video that really reflects kind of all the confusion going on, because I was reading just today in The Economist. It's from their Thursday their Thursday issue, so it's probably a few days outdated, but they were talking about how there have been misinformation campaigns in Ukraine trying to start or instigate violence against the Russians. And this video is between a State Department official and a reporter in the United States. And this State Department official discusses intelligence reports of Russia using kind of a false flag video to get Ukrainians encroaching on Russians, and then the Russians have an excuse to open fire or attack. And then a member of the media pushes back. And I think it illustrates how confused even our own institutions are about what to do. And maybe that's what Putin wants. So let's just take a look really quick.
We have previously noted our strong concerns regarding Russian disinformation and the likelihood that Moscow might seek to create, a false flag operation to initiate military activity. Now, we can say that the United States has information that Russia is planning to stage fabricated attacks by Ukrainian military or intelligence forces as a pretext for a further invasion of Ukraine. One possible option the Russians are considering, and which we made public today, involves the production of a propaganda video, a video with graphic scenes of false explosions, depicting corpses, crisis actors pretending to be mourners, and images of destroyed locations or military equipment, entirely fabricated by Russian intelligence.
Okay, well, that's quite a mouthful there. So you said actions such as these suggest otherwise, suggest meaning that they suggest they're not interested in talks and they're going to go ahead with some kind of a... What action are you talking about?
One, the actions I've just pointed to. The fact that Russia continues to engage in disinformation campaigns.
You made an allegation that they might do that. Have they actually done it?
What we know, Matt, is what I've just said, that they have engaged in this activity, in this planning activity. But let me because obviously this is not the first time we've made these reports public. You'll remember that just a few weeks ago.
I'm sorry. Made what report public?
If you let me finish, I will tell you what report we made public. We told you a few weeks ago that we have information indicating Russia also has already prepositioned a group of operatives to conduct a false flag operation in eastern Ukraine. So that, Matt, to your question, is an action that Russia has already taken.
It's an action that you say that they have taken, but you have shown no evidence to confirm that. And I'm going to get to the next question here, which is, what is the evidence that they... I mean, this is like crisis actors, really? This is like Alex Jones territory you're getting into now. What evidence do you have to support the idea that there is some propaganda film in the making?
Matt, this is derived from information known to the U.S. government, intelligence information that we have declassified. I think you know...
Okay, well, where is it? Where is this information?
Now, I played this video because I do think we need to be somewhat careful about the information and the intelligence we are trusting out of areas of the world where there are actors that want to sow disinformation and kind of destabilize our information systems. And I think a lot of Americans are more willing than ever to not trust our intelligence, especially after what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan, more specifically involving the CIA and weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. We don't want to go to war over just a false pretext. The other thing I would say, though, is that Russia just wants to make us question our own reality. And maybe Putin doesn't have to do much if we are fighting internally with one another in general over what is to be trusted. And I think that's something kind of interesting to note there. Now, we're just going to have to see. Again, this is changing daily. So I kind of try to cover this every week or every couple weeks just because, yeah, there's just so much evolving. You know, I've covered this a few times since this mass buildup of troops on the Ukrainian border has happened again. And it's just really hard to tell at this time. Now, I want to move on to the growing Republican civil war amongst elected Republicans in the United States, kind of around January 6th, and more just generally Trumpism in general. So going back to that Munich movie I mentioned earlier, and please bear with me, that German diplomat who I talked about, who was friends with the main character at Oxford, who now works high up in the Nazi government. If you recall what I talked about earlier, in the early 1930s, this German government worker was a huge supporter of the Nazi movement, even though he didn't agree with all of it. But by 1938, his girlfriend or friend, it's not really clear in the movie, was tortured and disabled because of being Jewish. And now, flash forward from when he was a defender of the Nazi regime to now he's working with the British to try and stop Hitler. And he mentions the reason he changed was because you can't only support certain parts of a radical regime. And in this case, it's Hitler, because if you support Hitler's nationalism and tried to make Germany powerful again, you're also supporting the racism, the hate, the anti-Semitism, and the dangerous fascism, and the violence. And this German character in the movie basically says, you love Hitler, because by supporting some of it, you're supporting all of it. And this makes me think of kind of the big break inside of the GOP and why it's important. Now, believe me, I'm not saying Trump is Hitler. I'm just using it as an idea of like, if you have a radical change in politics, or someone who is divisive or populist and has some radically controversial or hateful ideas, you can't just put those aside and agree with some of them. You know, some of these Republicans like Trump's tax policies or his Supreme Court nominations. But they also have to realize that if they support those and Trumpism, they're also getting the lies, the gaslighting about the election, and the willingness to incite a violent mob on the Capitol for your own political gains. And you can't get Trump's economic or social issues without also getting his autocratic behavior and his lies and his conspiratorial thinking and his division and his negative views of America. So I'm not, like I said, I'm not comparing Trump to Hitler, but I'm thinking that this January 6th committee is kind of forcing Republicans to have this internal dialogue to decide if they are fine with Trumpism or not. You know, there's no middle ground. And I think that is why Republicans and the RNC are getting so combative towards people like Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, just to name a few, because they are putting Republicans under the spotlight, and they're reminding them that Trump has a very bad side, a very autocratic side. And I think once people like Adam Kinzinger are gone, and he's leaving Congress after this term, the sycophants are going to keep trying to rewrite January 6th. And by then, I think it's going to be too late for accountability. And by then, I worry that if we don't really have a serious conversation about accountability and truth, I think one of the nation's two parties may be completely gone or evolved into something that's a liberal. And by now, I'm sure that most of you are aware that the RNC has voted to censure Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, which is very unprecedented and very rare and just insane to me. But they're doing it over the January 6th committee. So the rationale for this is that the committee, and specifically politicians like Kinzinger and Cheney, are helping with the, quote, persecution of ordinary citizens engaged in legitimate political discourse. I think what the RNC, the Republican National Committee, is basically saying is that we don't support the commission and we don't support Kinzinger and Liz Cheney because they are persecuting Republicans. And I guess this is going off of the lie that storming of the Capitol was really just a tourist visit, you know, this kind of evolving retconning of January 6th. And Ronna McDaniel, head chairwoman of the RNC, was part of this decision. I mean, it's a little ironic because she is Mitt Romney's niece, by the way. And some of us, myself included, would think that the best evidence that January 6th wasn't just a tourist visit is the video of her own uncle being escorted into the, out of the Capitol in a mask and with armed guards trying to make sure he doesn't get killed. He doesn't look too thrilled. I encourage people to watch that video. There is a video of Mitt Romney getting escorted by Capitol Police. Usually you don't get escorted out of the Capitol in what looks like an almost hostage situation when it's just a tourist visit. And I know that disinformation is everywhere now, but can eyes deceive you? Because I swear all of us saw the same thing on January 6th. Maybe we didn't. I don't know. Maybe I'm losing it, but I don't think so. I mean, we all saw the chaos that day, didn't we? People were smearing poop on walls and peeing and, you know, tasing cops and roughing up people. I mean, it sounds like a fascist mob. I'm sorry, you know, and I think sometimes we underestimate how quickly it could have literally devolved into a lynch mob on Mike Pence. Luckily, after this RNC decision to censure these two heroes, in my opinion, Liz Cheney, Adam Kinzinger, there has been a backlash in the Senate. The Senate, like I've always said on the old podcast and this one, is that the Senate is way more pragmatic. And there is some pushback on this RNC censure. So Politico reported that Senator Susan Collins of Maine, who's a Republican, said those who assaulted police officers, broke windows, and breached the Capitol were not engaged in legitimate political discourse. And to say so is absurd. Joni Ernst from Iowa, the number 5 GOP leader, said it shouldn't be the job of the RNC to censure individual members of Congress. She said it should be left up to the states. So kind of milquetoast, but I applaud at least some form of a stance against it. Both Lindsey Graham and Mitt Romney also agreed. Mitt Romney texted his niece. I can only imagine that was not a great conversation. And Mitch McConnell's not for it either. And, of course, there's Trumpian Republicans in the Senate still. I'm sure you can think of some. I sure can. That did support this. But more generally, my question to the Republican lawmakers here is, what do you want? Who are you trying to prove this to? Do you ever think these threats are going to go away, or are they just going to get worse? Like, you've made yourself answerable only to the mob, because they keep listening to the Trump base. They keep doing what they're told by the Trump base. They listen to the Marjorie Taylor Greenes and the Josh Hawleys, the Madison Cawthorns. They seem to think that this will help them in the long run. They think that it's the last promise to Trump and then it's going to go away. But they're signing a deal with the devil here, People like Kevin McCarthy think that, okay, well, we'll appease Marjorie Taylor Greene and we'll appease Trump. We'll censure the Republicans who voted to impeach Donald Trump and it's going to go away. But basically, Kevin McCarthy may become Speaker of the House after the midterms, but he's not going to have any autonomy. He's going to be now just a controlled victim of kind of the Trumpian mob, which is led by the Marjorie Taylor Greenes and the Matt Gaetzes and stuff like that. So I don't know at this point, like, if politics is all about power and influence, some of these congressmen and women that are still supporting this, they're going to get the opposite. They're going to become just even more sycophantic and have to just listen. I was listening to Adam Kinzinger today, actually, on the Bulwark podcast, and he had a good point. So there's this good book out right now that I'm actually reading as well called How Civil Wars Start and How to Stop Them by Barbara Walter. And she mentions how conflicts like a civil war usually happen in countries where they are stuck in the middle zone between a democracy and a dictatorship or autocracy. And she kind of thinks the U.S. is in that place right now, kind of having this identity crisis between an autocracy and a democracy. And she kind of says that once this happens, elected officials may start ignoring the rules and the safeguards that allowed them to get in power in the first place. So it's like you get to power, but then things start to change where you're like, you kind of use a cognitive bias to say like, it doesn't matter if we keep these guardrails in place. And Kinzinger mentions in the episode on the Bulwark that we are kind of getting close to that point Walter describes in her book. And right now this accountability is going. And he makes the point that there's a really short window of time left. It seems like right now is the breakup in the GOP between those who want accountability and those who want to embrace the craziness. And this is where I get back to the point of that Munich movie, when that German diplomat said that you can't just get some of the craziness of Hitler. It is a full package. And I think in the same sense here, this illiberal populism in the U.S. is dangerous, and you can't have some of it without getting all of it. Sadly, I think that the anti-Trump side, which is really just the pro-democracy side, has already lost this conflict. They have. I mean, let's be honest. They're all retiring or switching over to the Democratic side, or getting death threats, or just getting primaried or censured. I don't have time here to talk about it today, but there's Congressman Peter Meijer. There's a great article in The Atlantic that I encourage people to check out. But, he was a freshman congressman, voted to impeach Trump, very intelligent, but his own family didn't agree with him. And he realized over time that it was a futile attempt. And that's the sad thing, is accountability is going out the door. So this Republican Civil War, interestingly enough, it may be enough to help Democrats in the short term, because this might break up voters on the right. But in the long run, I don't think it's going to make the country healthier. The last thing I wanted to talk about here is the Olympics. So I first wanted to say I have been watching the Olympics. I have a few old teammates from back in the day that are in the Olympics, and I am so proud of them, and I have to watch. Shout out to Hannah Halverson, an old teammate of mine. Her dad's still someone I stay semi-close with, and I have to watch because her story is amazing. And J.C. Shoemaker, Joanne Reed, there's some people that I know, and I'd love to see them do well. And also, I don't think we should criticize the athletes, even though China is obviously not the best place to be having these right now, in my opinion. But I was watching the opening ceremony, and there's just so many contradictions just right out there in the open. You know, I remember when China walked down and did their unity flag. It's kind of where they passed the Chinese flag down a line of all the different ethnic groups in China. And it's very symbolic, but it's just ironic to watch them passing this flag down to show their support of all their ethnic groups when you know about the Uyghur situation that's been happening, which a lot of people call at least ethnic cleansing or some form of a cultural genocide, you know. And then about a few minutes later, after you see this, you see that Taiwan's athletes, out of I guess you could call it a compromise with China, have to be called Chinese Taipei. And you could just see the expressions on these Taiwanese athletes. They did not look thrilled. So there's that. You know that China's been trying to escalate tensions over Taiwan, and they're forcing the Taiwanese people to be known as Chinese Taipei in the Olympics. That doesn't sound very open Olympic energy to me. Then you have Ukraine walking during the opening ceremony, and Putin's there, and he just looks cold, you know. And the fact, I mean, just generally, the fact that Putin is one of the only leaders there, I think is all you really need to know about these Olympics. You know, most of, at least Western democracies, have done diplomatic boycotts of the Olympics. You just have to wonder, will history remember this Olympics well? Will it look something like the Berlin Olympics before World War II? Probably not to the same extent, but there's so many questions about where we choose to have these games. Then there's this Uyghur skier, this 20-year-old Uyghur skier who I was reading in the Daily Mail, quote, became the face of China's Winter Olympics and carried the Olympic torch, but then disappeared after finishing 43rd in her Nordic combined event. And there's wonders if this was a political stance from China and the IOC to show that the Uyghurs were welcome, because she carried the Olympic torch, raced, was the face of their Nordic skiing team, finished 43rd, so not particularly great, and then just is seen nowhere. So it's like, is this just a symbol to say that, hey, we're fine with the Uyghurs? Then there's reports of, you know, awful conditions in the Olympic Village, just draconian lockdowns with COVID, athletes not participating, lacks of resources from what I've gathered, you know. It's just weird. It's just very weird. And, you know, again, like I said, we need to celebrate the athletes. I don't think anyone's debating that. But I think much like the FIFA organization, the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, I think it's really the bad guy here. Like, I think everyone should watch the Olympics because the athletes don't deserve to be condemned or criticized. Like, they work so hard to get to these games. But to me, it's like the IOC has a hand in this. You know, they seem fine with the Olympics going on in China after all of this, and it's like FIFA with some of the scandals that have come out with bribes, autocracies, and human rights involving some of the places they've set up stadiums for the soccer. So I think international sports fall to a lot of the issues that we see with international organizations like the UN Human Rights Council, for example. And so it's really tough. But as I watch the Olympics, I just see so many contradictions right in front of me on the screen. So covered a lot here, kind of hodgepodge of things all over the place here. But yeah, Ukraine is interesting. The Republican Civil War is fascinating. Probably good for the Democrats. Probably not good for democracy in the long run. And the Olympics are just a walking contradiction. So go Team USA, but I can't support what's happening with the Olympics right now. So anyways, I'm on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Podbean, Twitter. Check me out. Give me a follow. Let me know your thoughts, and I'll be back later in the week. Take care, guys. Thanks.